Regularly scheduled programming will not be seen, so that we may bring you the following special presentation from WVEC TV.
Germans had instructions to hold the fire till the landing crafts hit the beach and the doors would open up. And just as soon as they get on the beach, that was it.
We made an imprint on history, and I was a part of it.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations.
I would like to say thank you to the American nation and to the American people for what they did for us during that time.
It was a dangerous age. The world, all of it, was in severe danger of coming under the heel of fascism. And in the darkest days of World War II, those of us who were old enough, and still for some reason not among the 16 million of our fellow citizens in uniform, saw these pictures in local theaters from week to week and wondered when it would end. But we did have an advantage, one the enemy didn't really count on. For one thing, we Americans were united as a people, not merely a federation of states. And the Allied powers were united as well, united as never before and never since, in a determination to win, since losing was an unacceptable outcome. But of our allies in Europe, only England was still free of Nazi occupation. By the beginning of June 1944, thanks to America's manufacturing might, Allied pilots were already carrying the war into the Nazi homeland. But if Hitler was truly to be defeated, it would be necessary to take the fight to him on the ground. And that required a toehold for land armies. And that required a trained force, equipped and motivated to do the job, to knock down the doors of Hitler's fortress Europa and take it away from an enemy that had years to dig in and defend. On June the 6th, 1944, the D-Day invasion began. The beaches of the Normandy Peninsula had been given code names that would come into the lexicon of war and stay as a tribute to men who crossed them in history's greatest invasion force. The beaches were called Sword and Gold and Juno and Utah, and in the case of Omaha Beach, Bloody Omaha. The 111th Field Artillery Battalion of the Virginia National Guard landed there on Bloody Omaha.
Just try to imagine, you're a young man, late teens, early 20s. The only beaches that have ever figured prominently in your life have been those at Virginia Beach and Ocean View. All of a sudden, you've got several hundred yards of strange beach to cross. And in these cliffs, German guns determine that you won't make it. Well, you can't imagine it. Neither can I. But I know 3 men who can.
One such man is Bill Halstead, a switchboard operator whose job it was to relay firing information and orders to the guns of the 111th.
No matter how deep I was in mud or something, I used to always tell my mother and father, everything's going good and don't worry.
Bill was quiet, stable, and you could put him in a switchboard situation, set him on a rock, and he'd stay there for hours and not move. Ideal man for the switchboard.
Buck Williamson was a sergeant of the 111th. His job was to pass the ammunition, the food of battle, and try not to let thoughts of his childhood sweetheart, Gaynell, get in the way of his job.
Yeah, we started off in grammar school together.
My mother must have had the impression that he was in a camp. He wrote back, what kind of war does she think that I'm in a camp? I'm in a hole.
Draper Gouldsby was a cook for the men of the 111th, and like many a GI cook, had to be resourceful to adequately feed his men. Some of the fellas called him Pretty Boy, and he doesn't deny to this day that he deserves the title.
They say you don't want any friends when you're in combat. But it felt mighty good to have all my buddies that I knew and grew up with to be together, because you didn't get homesick too much.
3 young men from Tidewater, Virginia, who had joined the Virginia National Guard years before America's entry into the war. And the 29th Division was federalized. In other words, they were in the Army now, and soon bound for England to prepare for history. And their passage there was aboard one of the world's most famous liners, the Queen Mary, which accidentally gave them an early taste of the horrors of war in an incident that was carefully kept secret for many years.
We went on first because we were artillery and they had guns on the Queen Mary.
As artillerymen, we were expected to man those guns if it was necessary.
We were about 200 miles from England because the Queen Mary traveled by itself. It didn't have an escort.
We saw the other ships coming out to meet us, to escort us in.
This British light cruiser came out to meet us, and he was zigzagging back and forth, looking for subs maybe. All of a sudden, the cruiser shot right in front of us. That big thing bearing down on him, and we couldn't stop. I guess we were going wide open and hit it and cut it right smack in two, just like you cut a piece of bread.
The cruiser broke in half. We could see below decks and see the men scrambling around, some of them in their underwear, some of them in their bunks. And within a few minutes, both ends of that ship were gone.
You could look right straight through it, and just as soon as the water hit the boiler, she said, whoo. She went up like that, and about 300 some men went down in about 2 minutes. They couldn't save them.
It was helpless and extremely surprising that the Queen Mary didn't stop. I couldn't understand that. I thought that was a dreadful thing, but now I understand why that happened. If the ship had stopped, we would have been too good a target.
And then when we pulled into Scotland, Queen Mary had a hole in it. It looked like it was about 2 stories high, just like you take a piece of watermelon and cut the front of it out, and everybody says, "What has happened to the Mary? What has happened to the Mary?" But we couldn't tell them what happened to the Mary.
Once ashore in England, Bill and Buck and Draper trained for the most terrible year of their lives, finally taken to ports such as Weymouth and Plymouth in the south of England for their trip to bloody Omaha.
It's almost impossible to put together this peaceful scene of today with the scene that must have been here 50 years ago, when these hills were swarming with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of troops who were about to board ships over there in Weymouth, getting accustomed to unfamiliar names such as Dirtle Door. That represents those white cliffs just back there. This harbor was filled with hundreds and hundreds of ships, and those young men were about to get on those ships and sail over there to France.
This year, they made practically the same trip, in far greater comfort and safety.
Much better than 1944. Much better. The deck is not slippery from those spam and eggs we had that morning.
But that earlier trip, a half-century before, was heavily on each of their minds, and they talked about their memories of bloody Omaha more than a little. And the wonderment, even today, that they made it through alive was apparent.
Wide, wide beach, no cover whatsoever, and they had a perfect opportunity to shoot at you. I believe the destroyer is the only thing that saved us, Buck.
We chose to tell tonight's story not from the perspective of presidents and generals and field marshals and prime ministers, but from the viewpoint of the regular soldier, and by extension, the 16 million Americans who donned their country's uniform in a dangerous time, but a time when our states and our people were truly united. When we come back, the return to bloody Omaha.
If there is a symbol of this lovely region of France called Normandy, it's this, Mont Saint-Michel. It's been fought over and argued about for centuries. It survived battles between French and English kings, monastic orders, and homegrown dukes. It survived the greatest battle of all, the one Winston Churchill called not the end, not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning.
On the morning of June the 6th, 1944, the largest land invasion in mankind's history started on the coast of France, and it was there, on bloody Omaha, that the 29th Division, the Virginia National Guard, received its baptism in fire. And it was a total immersion baptism. The other beaches had air cover. Omaha had none. And bloody Omaha was defended not by the usual coastal battalions, but seasoned regular troops. Add the fact that the Germans had years to dig in and harden their defensive positions, and thus suffered little from the naval bombardment that preceded the landing. These were the facts facing Bill and Buck and Draper and their buddies of the 111th at about 8:30 that morning, in full daylight and full view of the German positions on the bluffs just behind the beach. Their mission was to get their overloaded ducks, which were more truck than boat and not manageable in the heavy seas, ashore, with 14 artillery pieces, howitzers, plenty of ammunition, and men to use them against the Germans. But things didn't go as planned.
They were just popping up and down because it was a terrible storm. Coxswains started rendezvousing around the head of shore, and the waves hit them sideways and just turned them all over. We were lucky that it found us out there in the water. So he pulled me in, and I was just about exhausted then, and I finally got back on the ship, and I said to my commanding officer, Captain Hodges, I said, Captain, I was scared because I lost my switchboard. He says, Bill, I done lost the whole battery. Don't worry about switchboard. I said, I guess we're going back to England now. They said, no, we're going to shore. And the Navy boy, he gave me a Navy jacket and a pair of dungarees and a steel helmet. And when I hit the beach, that's all I had.
The only thing we could see was what was immediately in our area. We knew there were thousands of ships out there, and we knew we were just part of a big ball game. We were very confused, although we had friends with us and there was comfort in numbers. And since we had lost our artillery piece, we were somewhat lost as to what to do.
Like thousands of others just like them, the boys from Virginia were scattered and scared. Just surviving was almost miraculous.
The whole beach was just lined up with burning vehicles and bodies. I mean, it was a terrible sight.
I could look at a wounded soldier or a dead soldier on the beach, but when I saw one floating in the water and the waves just beating them back and forth, it bothered me. I figured that if a person was dead, they should let him rest. Omaha Beach, we are here. This is it. We're going down to Verville Draw right now. Yes, sir, we have come back.
Revisiting bloody Omaha 50 years in the wake of that longest day of their lives, Bill and Buck and Draper left no doubt that their memories were as fresh as ever.
They had guns on each of these corners, and then machine guns and riflemen lined up there. And then back up the draw further, they had some machine guns, because they knew that this was a target area. Germans had instructions to hold the fire till the landing crafts hit the beach and the doors would open up. And just as soon as you get on the beach, that was it. You had to wait a right good ways before you got ashore. And then after you got ashore, then you had to go all the way up where the rocks were, and machine gun bullets were going in mines all on the beach. And they had those tank traps. And the plan failed. The ducks sank. We was picked up as stragglers. We're brought in and dumped. Now, my first thought when I hit that beach right there, what do I do now? And I think I ran right up to that wall. And the first man I met was Sergeant Hubert Henman. All right, meeting somebody that you knew from your own outfit gave you some assurance.
Yes.
Now I'm comfortable. I feel better. And we hugged those rocks.
Comfortable, really the word, Buck.
Not quite.
Comfortable wasn't quite the word.
That gun up there is not pointing to the beach, but it's pointing down the beach. They gave him a lot larger field of fire. Scary. They knew what they were doing. They just didn't do quite enough. A lot of good men lost their life on this beach, but
Sure did.
50 years is a long time, but not long enough to forget lost friends. Even the heavens seemed to agree that some special memorial was in order when Bill and Buck and Draper came to salute their sacrifice on bloody Omaha. What had been well-defended shores of Hitler's fortress Europa gradually became a lively port, a port where the men and munitions would come ashore to complete the job of dismantling Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. Once the beachheads had been established, the young Americans, along with their British comrades in arms, learned the meaning of bocage country, a reference to the hedgerows Norman farmers have used for centuries to define and protect their fields. In June of '44, the invaders soon found how effective the hedgerows were as lines of defense for the well-dug-in Germans. Progress toward the interior of France was measured literally hedgerow by hedgerow. The hedgerows, not random growth by any means, had been cultivated since time immemorial to be as impenetrable as possible.
they dig down in there, Jim, and then you couldn't see them, and then they'd mow you down. Sometimes it would take the boys, might go from here to that part way down there. It'd probably take them all day long.
Just to get that far.
Our tactic was, you were here, you wanted to go there. He was shooting at you. Go down to the ends and see if you could work your way around. So there wasn't just something you could just knock over real easy.
Then there were the coastal towns, their people anxious to be liberated from the hated German troops. The Germans just as anxious to hold them and drive the invasion force back into the sea. A major objective for the 29th Division was St. Lo. It would be well over a month, the 18th of July, before the 29th captured the small city, engraving stories of heroism into the division's record. There was, for example, Major Tom Howie.
I remember Major Howie as being what I would classify an excellent military officer. He knew how to lead men, and he knew his military science. His famous speech was, "I will see you in St. Lo." He was killed. General Gerhardt ordered that his body be carried into St. Lo and placed on the rocks in front of the church. When we finally did go through St. Lo, the convoys passed Major Howie's body.
With St. Lo in hand, the 29th endured several more weeks of rivers, ravines, and hedgerows to take the city of Veer. Again, a key outpost the Germans were defending fiercely in their fight to hold the Normandy region. The fight was so fierce that it practically leveled Veer. But to citizens of Veer, it was both welcome and necessary. Raymond Renault was just a girl at the time.
J'ai perdu 7 personnes dans ma famille.
I lost 7 members of my family because of American bombardments. It was war. They were buried in the rubble. We understood it was war.
C'était la guerre.
The Allied plan then called for the march into Germany to begin. But plans, even mighty plans, don't always go as expected. And Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, persuaded a reluctant Supreme Commander Eisenhower to turn toward Paris. For years, the French had lived with the dismal reality of their precious city of Paris, occupied by the hated Nazis. But even though they had some French help, the Nazis never conquered the French spirit.
constantly we met Germans on the street, but we had a special attitude as if they were transparent, you know. We looked through them, you know. We had a way of ignore them completely.
I think I saw the most beautiful young man I ever saw in my life. But he was a German. I couldn't speak to him.
But even before the Allied armies arrived in triumph, a smaller but equally loyal army was quietly fighting. When we return, the army without uniforms.
Paris, the city of light, but before dark and terrible years under the occupation of the Nazis. They used to stage parades here at the Arc de Triomphe on almost a daily basis to show the people they were in charge. And they were in charge, mostly, but for one thing, an army that didn't wear uniforms. It was called the Resistance.
Even with most of Europe firmly under the heel of the Nazi boot, the Resistance Army was active. Their missions varied, from harassing the Germans, especially the Gestapo, Hitler's feared secret police, to rescuing and smuggling Allied pilots to safety. The Resistance sabotaged military operations, published and distributed secret newspapers, gathered information on German plans and troop movements, and accepted the heavy risk all these forbidden activities meant for any false step. Among these secret soldiers, Anne-Cécile Padoue, a young woman from Strasbourg, whose family had moved to Paris.
My job was very simple. It was to cycle in Paris. But they were mostly girls because they were less conspicuous. My mother did a lot of things. She was very brave because we sheltered several times English pilots who were sending wireless to England. And I was very fascinated by them, you know, coming from another world. We were distributing underground newspapers. On the 25th of November, the Gestapo arrested many people, and we were warned by friends who could escape. So we escaped, and the Gestapo came to our place too late. We took the train to a certain place where we knew that friends were able to give us identity cards, false identity cards, which was indispensable for us. Unfortunately, the friends who gave us those identity cards were arrested a few days after, sent to Ravensbrück, and we never saw them again.
In Paris, as elsewhere in Europe, the underground fighters had to live with the fact that discovery by the Nazis usually meant torture for information, then death, quickly and without trial. So resistance cells were organized so that no single person knew too much. The Nazis couldn't learn what they didn't know. All this in the streets and boulevards of one of the world's most beautiful cities.
Can you imagine? Hitler wanted to level all of this. As a matter of fact, his last question to his commander in Paris was, "Is Paris burning?" But it wasn't. How could they?
The Germans had mined many of the treasures of Paris, the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, even the Arc de Triomphe, and the colorful bridges over the Seine. In Hitler's view, if he couldn't have Paris, there would be no Paris. But even Hitler's own minions hesitated when it came to actually destroying the City of Light. The weakened German garrison fell quickly to the resistance and the advancing Allied armies, and General de Gaulle was given the honor of leading his Free French into the city to claim victory. If you were there, it was an unforgettable moment.
I was on the Champs-Élysées when de Gaulle came down. People yelling, crying, shouting, kissing each other, flags coming out. It was a lot of emotion. And then some men started shooting from the roofs, and we all scattered.
I remember that when the shooting started, I had a white dress. And that dress was so white I didn't want that it would be dirty, so I just stood up.
Among the first order of business in liberated Paris, the identification and quite often public humiliation of collaborators. For some of the more serious helpers of the hated Nazis, the penalty was death. For others, the scorn of their fellow Parisians. But the major theme was jubilation. And even though months of war lay ahead, a sense of victory, a celebration of freedom. When we return, a look at life under the Germans and other quiet heroes of the long war against Nazism. Stories of the underground in Europe were legion, in Belgium and the Netherlands, in the Scandinavian countries, eastward in Poland and Czechoslovakia, even in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, a nation hardly bigger than some American counties. The secret heroes of the resistance organized in cells such as the Red Lions, units working in small groups and singly to foil the Nazi occupation troops, to stay a step ahead of the Gestapo. One such fighter was Madeleine Fischbach, who talks as matter-of-factly about her underground duties as if it were just another job.
I had various missions. I had to go fetch papers. I had to give news to the families of the boys that had run away. I didn't even know that I was in any danger until people disappeared, and the circle grew forever smaller.
But it was more than just a routine job. It was personal. One of Madeleine's brothers had been impressed into service in the German Army Eastern Front, fighting the Russians, and another was imprisoned at a place called Dachau.
We thought those were prisons, and we didn't know what went on in the concentration camps, but people were tortured there, and some could not hold out. They were so tortured. We did not know the danger we were in. We did not know the beast we were dealing with.
But the face of the beast they were dealing with was revealed at such places as this, Dachau, the infamous concentration camp near Munich. And the horror was far greater than anyone could possibly imagine.
Dachau was the first of the Nazis' many concentration camps, built near Munich, the birthplace of Nazism. Dachau, like many other such hellish places, was built to house slave laborers and filled with those who fell outside Hitler's definition of the super race he thought Germany was to become under his leadership. These included Jews in overwhelming numbers, gypsies, homosexuals, the handicapped, and those who suffered from mental illness. And the Nazi definition of mental illness was extreme. Dr. Anne-Marie Sinninger was a student in Munich.
A friend of my mother's was experiencing a menopause-related mental imbalance. Nothing life-threatening, to be sure. Her doctor had sent her to a sanatorium. Of course we were alarmed and told of this at home. My father grew very agitated and said anything could happen to her. A few weeks later, she was dead. She was murdered.
When the horror of the death camps was first revealed, it was with the liberation of Auschwitz in Poland by the Soviet Army. Some Americans believed it was merely communist propaganda. But as the truth finally unfolded in all its hideous proportions, with the liberation of similar death camps by Allied troops, all claims of exaggeration were put aside. The truth was too terrible to describe. General Eisenhower immediately ordered the documentation of the Nazi atrocities. Some American troops, reacting to what they saw in the camps, exacted summary justice on many SS guards. In the case of Dachau, local German citizens were forced to visit the camp and look at scenes too terrible to describe, and deal with the fact that these crimes had been committed by their countrymen and ignored by other Germans. To the credit of the Germany of today, the Nazi crimes are a central theme in the study of history. When we visited Dachau, numerous groups of students were being lectured. Perhaps it would comfort them somewhat to know that half a century before, kids their age were asking uncomfortable questions.
One of the little-known facts about World War II is that there was also a resistance of sorts right here in Germany. Some students here at the university in Munich launched a leaflet campaign to the effect that Hitler was not telling the people the truth. They were tried, found guilty, and executed within a matter of days.
They called them the White Rose Gang, though gang seems a heavy word for such as Hans and Sophie Scholl, whose crime was to toss a handful of leaflets from a university window. The leaflets asked the German government to tell the truth and asked the German people to wake up and realize what was happening all around them. Recent newspaper articles seem to confirm the Germans of today, as well as the victims of the Nazis, agree on the motto, never again. When we come back, food and freedom in a Europe hungry for both. Though it was relatively non-violent as battles go, the liberation of Paris will probably always stand out as one of the stronger memories of the war in Europe. But it was still very much a hot war for Allied soldiers. There was the Battle of the Bulge, a Christmas season attack by the Germans in a desperate effort to regain control of the port of Antwerp. Even those who do not read history will remember Bastogne and General McAuliffe, in command of the surrounded Americans, responding to a demand of surrender with the single, short, but decidedly unequivocal answer, nuts. Allied forces, anxious for a place to cross the Rhine, were astounded to find the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen relatively undamaged, though the Germans were trying to destroy it. In another history-making operation, Allied forces took the bridge. 8,000 ground troops moved across in less than a day, while the largest airdrop of British and American paratroopers, more than 23,000, secured the advance beyond the Rhine. Hitler, characteristically, had the German officers who failed to blow the bridge executed. The Virginia National Guard, meanwhile, was occupied with fierce German resistance at the port of Brest, Germany's last access to the Atlantic, and then fighting their way to the German border by mid-September, and on the way delivering the first taste of freedom and welcome tastes of food. In fact, friends and enemies alike, all along the route from D-Day to VE Day, found Americans well supplied with foods long missing from their diets, and a typical American willingness to share. And they remember.
By the time 1944 had come, we welcomed the Americans simply because their cans of peaches or their fruit that they had or their candy bars or odd little things, and we thought, if America's on our side and they've got all that, we've got to win this war. And I think that you probably can't realize that in America, how hard up for food we were.
When I saw the first Americans arriving towards Arc de Triomphe, all these soldiers started to throw on the pavement cigarettes, chocolate, cookies. And I saw my fellow citizens fighting to pick up on the pavement. And I was so ashamed. And one soldier on one of these tanks realized that I was in tears. They didn't realize that it was lack of food. And let me tell you something, I think that this fight for life, for food, changed so much French minds. Now the French people are no longer as courteous as they used to be, as kind. And to me, this is due to the war.
Every school child got a warm lunch given by the Americans. It was nothing sensational, but as I remember, it was rice and noodles and, on occasion, chocolate cookies. Oh, chocolate, that was glorious. We hadn't even seen chocolate in such a long time.
Small wonder that many German soldiers fighting Russians on the Eastern Front made their way through what remained of German territory to surrender to the generous GIs. And after the stories from the East about the Russian rampage of looting and rape, Germans were amazed and gladdened to see that the Americans did not follow that tradition of so many European wars. Some say the flood of refugees from the Soviet advance toward the Allied front was the greatest single mass migration in history. It is also said that Hitler killed himself rather than be taken prisoner by the Russians. However, it is more likely that he feared the results if taken by his own people, having seen what happened to Benito Mussolini at the hands of Italians. It fell to a relative underling to surrender, and an American president barely months in office to make the announcement.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
The war in Europe was over.
Tonight there is but one thought in the mind of all America: victory in Europe.
Today is Victory in Europe Day. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing.
Kiss me twice and kiss me once again. It's been a long, long time. Haven't felt like this, my dear, since can't remember when. It's been a long, long time.
Here is a special bulletin from Washington. The national brownout has been lifted. Londoners threw off the image of restraint as they took to the streets in joyous celebration. The war in Europe was officially over at midnight, May 8, 1945.
"50 years, a half a century, and we're still living in a world defined and shaped by World War II and its outcome. There was the Yalta Conference, the great summit to plan the peace. It wound up drawing the early battle lines in the Cold War. And while Stalin's program called for dismantling what was useful in Eastern Europe and shipping it back to the Soviet Union, the Marshall Plan became not only the short-term salvation of Western Europe, but also its springboard to prosperity. But the war had a subtler legacy for us. It was called the baby boom.
1, 2, 3. I had 3 children in 3 years.
And you remember that Navy jacket we told you about? The one given to Bill Halstead by a Navy man who pulled him out of the water and put him ashore at bloody Omaha? Well, Bill gave it back to the Navy, to the Aegis cruiser Normandy, where it's a treasured memento of that long-ago day. That terrible day.
It really shows the younger guys what they're really out here for and fighting for, and brings back some of the great moments of history.
Might be still a little sand in here, I don't know, in the pockets.
And speaking of mementos, tourists in Virginia Beach are being ferried around these days in ducks, that infamous floating truck that didn't float all that well in the seas off Normandy, especially loaded with howitzers. Bill, however, hasn't expressed a great desire for another duck ride.
On behalf of the American people, we say thank you. Thank you, and God bless you.
Here at home, VE Day was marked by ceremony in many places, and probably in many hearts that needed no ceremony for rekindling memories. But in Europe, they pulled out all the stops. In England, the Queen presided, if queens preside, over concerts and parades and other glitzy affairs. But English memories, after all, included some we Americans escaped. The specter of war on their own homeland, bleak years when the outcome was uncertain, and the lifting spirits when the Americans arrived.
I have a great feeling that we in this country generally owe a lot to the American nation, not only the GIs, the American nation as a whole. I would like to say thank you to the American nation and to the American people for what they did for us during that time.
Our three old soldiers were clearly glad they came, 50 years ago and again this year.
We made an imprint on history, and I was a part of it. The freedom that we gave the people in Europe was so valuable to them. I've met strangers on the streets, and they say thank you.
It was clear, too, that those who remember the Americans and their hand in the liberation intend those memories to last, to live on in coming generations. If you drive into the city of Bayeux, there stands Dwight Eisenhower to greet you. In St. Lo, Major Howie and the 29th hold a special place of honor near the center of town and on a billboard as you enter St. Lo. In Bastogne, a tank in the city square to remember the Battle of the Bulge, General McAuliffe in his verbal sneer at a German suggestion he surrender. In Luxembourg, which was liberated twice by General George Patton's army, July the 6th marks Remembrance Day in honor of General Patton. It's there in Luxembourg, near the village of Ham, that Patton is buried, along with more than 5,000 of his men. And one can hardly fail to notice, walking there among the gravestones, how many young men died so near to Christmas of 1945. It's a melancholy you'll feel at Margraten in Holland, where more thousands are buried, and at St. Mère-Église and St. Lo, and 21 other towns and villages in France. In Belgium, they lie at rest at Bastogne and Liège, and back in England at Brookwood and Cambridge. Men who will remain forever young to their surviving friends are buried all over the world. It was, after all, a world war. And fields of honor such as these are to be found in Hungary and Norway, in Portugal and Sweden and Switzerland, to the south in Mediterranean lands at places called Cassino and Salerno, and Sardinia and Sicily. In Africa, at Senegal and Tripoli and Tunis. In the cold northern Aleutians at Sitka, and the steamy South Pacific at Tarawa and Bougainville. At Kwajalein in Fiji, in the Marshalls in the Philippines and New Guinea and New Zealand, in Samoa, in the Solomons, in India and China and Burma, and even in your own hometown, almost anywhere in America, like Norfolk, Virginia.
We could relate statistics forever and still not come close to describing the true price of victory. For more than 400,000 Americans, mostly young Americans, the price was life itself. In that huge and impersonal number were Bill Halstead's buddies of the 111th. He took their loss very personally. He memorialized them here in Norfolk's Forest Park. An old soldier's tribute to men for whom the price of freedom was anything but free.